Good morning. It's Tuesday the 15th of June 2021 and it's time for DaviePHD's Mythbusters, episode 35. Many things are said about Scotland, independence, the Union, the European Union, etc. And in these videos I bust the myths that many people believe and are commonly peddled by those opposed to Scots independence. This week we explore the possibility that the G7 isn't all it's cracked up to be, and how Scotland could be better off out of it altogether. Now you'd have to be blind, deaf or just nae paying attention not to know that the G7 were meeting in Cornwall last week. And with all the pomp and ceremony surrounding the whole event, you could be forgiven for thinking that would be a really important club to be in. But it's not. In fact, I could think of few things that make less of a difference to the lives of ordinary people than whether or not their nation is in the G7, and I'm pretty sure that Scotland doesn't need it. The G7 began as the G5 back in 1973. It was an informal gathering of finance ministers for the world's 5 largest developed industrialised countries. Now, the definition of a developed industrialised country is a bit vague. As an example, no one could deny that China is a vast industrial global player. So why is there no seat at the G7 table for them? Well, that's basically because they're not a democracy and there's so much poverty in the country that they can't consider it a developed country, so it doesn't meet the conditions for entry. Likewise with India. If you look at just the money, India sits just below the UK in the list of the world's wealthiest nations, and they are a democracy, but there's so much poverty they're not considered developed and don't meet the conditions for entry. If you take the top economy in the G7, the USA, it's the largest economy in the world based on nominal GDP. Now that's basically the population's combined GDP. If you use another measure, GDP per person parity, or PPP, that is how much is generated by each citizen. Then the top nation is Monaco, which, if you look at the nominal GDP figure, is the 154th richest nation in the world. So, if we took the current G7 and ranked them in terms of their GDP per person parity, it looks like this. Number 1 is still the USA, but it would be 10th overall in the world. Germany would move up to number 2, replacing Japan, but it would be the 16th biggest economy in the world. Canada would be number 3, and it's the 21st in PPP. 4th would be France, who come 22nd in GDP per person parity. 5th would be the United Kingdom, slipping down a rank, 23rd with GDP per person parity. 6th would be Japan, 25th with GDP per person parity. And 7th would be Italy, in 26th place overall. Now, admittedly, none of the current G7 are in the lower reaches of the GDP per person parity league tables. But the nominal GDP that entry to the G7 is qualified on does not translate to wealth of the average citizen or an assured quality of life for them. Now, if China were to be admitted to the G7, it would be the second largest economy in it. But there's no doubt that their citizens don't enjoy the same freedom and quality of life we do. If India were admitted, they'd be the 5th biggest economy in it, but we all know that some people in India live in abject and seemingly inescapable crushing poverty. So, if we were to take GDP per person parity G7, it would consist of Monaco, Liechtenstein, Singapore, Kuwait, Brunei, Luxembourg and Norway. None of the real G7 to be seen. If we were to look at the World Happiness Index, their G7 would consist of Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, the Netherlands and Sweden. Again, not one of the real G7 to be seen. If we look at pension provision, that G7 would consist of the Netherlands, Denmark, Israel, Australia, Finland, Sweden, with Singapore and Norway in equal 7th. Yet again, not one of the real G7 to be seen. Now, there are many metrics you could use to measure the success of a country by, and if you work through them and compile issue by issue G7s, appearances of the actual G7 are few and far between. In fact, they're almost non-existent. But there are nations which show up quite regularly, usually small independent nations like Iceland, Finland, Norway. Particularly Norway, the only one to show up on all three examples I laid out. Now, if you were to tell an average person in India that their nation was the 6th richest in the world, I think they might have trouble believing you. If, however, you told them that their nation was the 116th richest, that sounds more reflective of their individual circumstances. This argument illustrates why nominal GDP is a poor indicator of how a country is governed, and why the current G7 may not be best qualified to be leading all the big decisions for the rest of us. GDP per person parity, World Happiness Index, or OECD pension provision are far better indicators of how well a nation is governed, as they refer to the quality of a society and how well it looks after its citizens. It's not just based on the size of its economy. And it's also no coincidence that most of the alternate G7 nations, based on societal quality metrics, are filled with small, successful, independent countries who think and act so differently to most of the G7, and particularly the United Kingdom. But this is a Scots independence blog, so what about Scotland? Now, when you consider that Scottish interests are largely ignored even within the United Kingdom, then do we really expect a UK government led by Boris Johnson, who generally only serves the interests of his donors and of course himself, to be pushing forward Scottish interests at the G7 and similar gatherings? We're often told that through being part of the United Kingdom that Scotland shares the UK's status of being part of the G7, being a founding member of the United Nations, being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, etc., etc. But the fact is that this status costs us a massive amount of money and political capital, whilst it brings very little benefit to the average citizen of any of the countries in these clubs, particularly Scotland. We are often told that Scotland is dependent on the broad shoulders of the UK economy to keep us afloat. And if this was true, then surely our UK standing in the world would shoot up if they were free of us. But as I recently laid out, 3 ex-Tory chancellors, one of whom went on to become Prime Minister, all say that if Scotland departed the UK, their standing would diminish in the G7 and all other international gatherings. Someone, either the current Tory government or the 3 ex-Tory chancellors, aren't telling the truth about this. The fact is that the UK government is addicted to its status as one of the world's great players. And to be brutally honest, I find this status addiction to be pretty sad, and if I'm more than... I actually find it a little pathetic. The building of a £200 million trade yacht, Johnson flying from London to Cornwall in a massive private jet so he didn't get shown up by Joe Biden in Air Force One, and other Union Jackery extravagances show no signs of abating. If Scotland stays with the UK, we'll never get to focus on individual well-being. It will always be status, and eventually we'll end up looking just as ridiculous as our UK by association with them. But if we leave the UK, we can realign our goals and make our way into some of the alternate G7s, where GDP is measured per person rather than as an unequally distributed collective, where we pursue happiness alongside the acquisition of wealth, where we measure our nation's place in the world based on societal goals rather than financial ones. All you've got to do, folks, is support it. And crucially, when you get the chance, vote for it. Folks, thanks for watching. Please feel free to share this video with anyone you like, especially undecided voters. DaviePHD.